Now we have established that the great crisis in Israel's affairs, marked by the quotation of Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, occurs at Matthew 13, 14, and 15, and not at Acts 28, 26, 27. The question at once arises how it all fits into the four accounts. So far as Matthew's gospel itself is concerned, the matter is plain enough. This pronouncement marks the end of open public proclamation by the Lord Jesus and the beginning of individual or private instruction. At this point is found the first mention of parable. Thereafter, public teaching is largely either in answers to questions or in parables. There is no public pronouncement in any way comparable with the Sermon on the Mount. This comes out clearly when we examine the echoes of the sermon in Luke's Gospel. The first parallel in Luke is between Matthew 7, 7 through 11, and Luke 11, 9 through 13, to the disciples. The next, Matthew 5:15 and Luke 11:33, followed by Matthew 6, 22 and 23, and Luke 11:34 and 35, form part of a short speech in Luke 8 verses to the throngs. The next, Matthew 6, 25, 33, is paralleled by Luke 12, 22, 31, followed by Matthew 6, 20 and 21, paralleled by Luke 12, 33 and 34, all to the disciples. Next, Matthew 5, 25 and 26, and Luke 12, 58 and 59 to the throngs. Next, Matthew 7, 13 and 14, and Luke 13, 24, followed by a not very close parallel between Matthew 7, 22 and 23, and Luke 13, 25 and 27. Next come Matthew 5, 13 and Luke 14, 34 and 35, Matthew 6, 24 and Luke 16, 13, Matthew 5, 18 and Luke 16, 17. In each of these, the Lord Jesus is reproducing isolated items of the sermon to meet the requirements of subsequent events, and a careful examination will show how completely circumstances had changed. Something of the nature of the change is indicated again when the only parable before Matthew 13, 14, and 15 is examined. This is found in Luke 7, 41 and 42, and in fact, by comparison with the others, it can barely be regarded as a parable at all. Instead of being a general illustration or an instructive story, it is a private question to one man. Certainly, it is very different from the parable of the sower, which shortly follows. The corresponding points to Matthew 13 in verses 14 and 15 are Mark 4:12 and Luke 8:10. In John's Gospel, the whole period comes within the gap between the 5th and 6th chapters. The parallel section of Luke raises an interesting problem. Matthew 12, verses 46 through 50, and Mark 3, verses 31 through 35, and Luke 8, verses 19 through 21, are generally regarded as the same event. But Luke's account of the parable of the sower precedes it, while Matthew's and Mark's follow it. Dr. Bullinger contends in his companion Bible that the parable was pronounced twice. If this is so, then a part of the quotation from Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10, and Luke 8:10 was pronounced before the Lord's words of condemnation in Matthew 12, 25 through 45, which are the occasion for the pronouncement of Isaiah's judgment. This robs the account of all its point, and it is far easier and more reasonable to assume either that Luke 8, 19 through 21 is a parenthesis or that the event occurred twice. First in Matthew 12, 46 through 50, and Mark 3, 31 through 35, and a second time after Matthew 13, 52. This will explain Luke's rather different wording. Another problem is the portion peculiar to Mark 4, 21 through 29, placed beside Matthew 13 and read into it. There is a feeling of irrelevance which spoils the argument. Yet, as the companion Bible shows in its setting in Mark, it is quite harmonious. Perhaps two talks occurred. The connected series of 8 parables in Matthew, and immediately afterwards the shortest set in Mark, each being intended to carry out its own special lesson. This may be the point of the concluding sentence of Mark 4:34. Because so much attention has been diverted from Matthew 13:14 and 15 to Acts 28, verses 26 and 27, we have tended to underestimate the change marked by the former and to discover a change accompanying the latter, which is simply not there. Acts 28:28 does not mark the end of the history, but Acts 28:31. True, the subsequent events are compressed into 3 verses, but the fact that any account of them exists at all is fatal to the Acts 28:28 boundary line theory, particularly when we bear in mind that Paul was telling the Roman Jews what had happened to their fathers. Matthew 13 opens the series of events which resulted in the saving work of God reaching the Gentiles. They did not appear in the picture then, but for the vast throngs of Israel, it was a crisis indeed, as the sequel showed. It is much to be regretted that so little attention is paid to the comparative study of the 4 Gospels. Dr. Bullinger's solution in the Companion Bible of the problem of fitting them into one consecutive narrative without distortion is satisfactory on the whole. A few major points and a number of minor ones need reconsideration. If that were accomplished, a conspectus of the whole in 4 parallel columns would be possible. The foregoing study is no more than a brief sample of what might be done along these lines. In view of the truly wonderful unfoldings of the inner meaning and significance of the earthly life of the Lord Jesus, which Mr. Thompson has recently given us, it is abundantly plain that we ought to pay more attention to the 4 Gospels. For myself, it is not too much to say that I am reading them with fresh eyes.